My name is Jon Nehlsen. I am a member of the Riverview School District School Board and co-chair of the Finance Committee. Here to talk to you this afternoon about the 2017-2018 school budget. To give you some of my thoughts and some updates on it. A couple of things to tell you before I get started. My day job is that I am an associate dean at the School of Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, which happens to be where I'm standing right now talking to you. Also, I'd like to just make the disclaimer that the things I'm going to talk about today are my own thoughts and entirely my own thoughts. They hopefully reflect the views of many of the other school board members, but perhaps not in some cases. And one of the really cool things about being on the school board for the past year that I've enjoyed is the ability to work with other people who are very bright and very capable and very engaged and very caring, but with whom I may disagree, and I think that's okay. I think we need not be unanimous on every topic, specifically ones as tricky as the ones we take on here in public education, and so that's all right. That's democracy. That's part of the process, and it's supposed to be messy. So with that disclaimer, let me get started. Okay. So this is the latest budget update. My plan for today is to do a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to do is to make a series of somewhat, I think, controversial statements, some of which will probably aggravate you, but which I think are true and which I think need to be said and need not to be sugarcoated. So I'm going to start off by making some controversial statements. Then I want to talk in some detail about this year's budget, what's in it, what the components of it are, and so forth. And then talk about, finally, about my hopes for the district, my aspirations for the district, and but also some fears that I have and some vulnerabilities that I'm pretty sure are looming in the background that we need to understand and we need to start to think about and be courageous about how we deal with them. So that's the plan for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay. So let me introduce you to a young man. He is a young man who will be attending one of our kindergarten classes starting next August, in just a couple of months. He is, I think, a pretty typical young boy. He likes baseball. He likes Wookiees. And so is I think pretty typical. The thing is, though, that while you may see a young boy with blue eyes and cute little kid, and his mom would thank you for saying that, I see something different. When I look at this, I see $22,000. Okay, $22,000 is the amount that we will spend next year for him and for each and every child in our district to educate them for 1 year. Okay, so the cost to educate this young man is $22,000, but it's not just $22,000. It's $22,000 for next year and for the subsequent 12 years that he'll be in our system, compounded at some interest rate annually, right? So when you add it all up, the real cost of educating each and every one of, including this child, but each and every one of our children, is well north of $250,000 per child. And if that number shocks you or alarms you, I'm glad. It did the same to me, and it should. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and so I put it there purposefully. Let me, though, try to put it into some perspective for you. So this is a street. It's a street near my own home, so if I took a picture of your home here, I apologize, but I just use it to illustrate sort of a typical situation in our school district. It is it's a street with somewhat modest homes, well-maintained lawns, and friendly neighbors. I think very typical of Oakmont or Verona. And I picked it because there are 6 homes on this block. Okay? And the reason I picked it because there are 6 homes on the block is that this is how many tax-paying homes it costs us to educate the young man I showed you a minute ago. It costs 6 homes, 6 households paying taxes into our system on average, right, to cover the cost of 1 child. And so you might ask, how many of these homes actually have children or send a child or children into our district? And that's the same question I had. So I looked at it, and the answer is that out of the 6, on average, only 1 household will send a child or children into our district. And so what that means is that, I guess, if you're a lucky enough parent to have a child in the school or children in the school, that maybe we should thank our 5 nearest neighbors for helping to support that process. And so I'll say for in my case, to Jack, to Mo, to Dave, to Hunter, to the guy next to Hunter who hasn't moved in yet, but hopefully soon will, thank you, because all of us together are actually paying the freight on supporting this young man going into our system, okay? And that's very important to understand, right? It's very important to understand because it means that there are people who are not feeling a direct benefit, they're not parents, who are paying for this process, who are paying to educate our kids, to educate this young man, but do not feel the direct benefit. So this young woman, for example, let's call her Eleanor, is one of the people who would be paying into our system but not feeling the direct benefit. Now, on a separate day and a separate talk, if the public's interested, I would be happy to give a talk on why I think strong schools are good for Eleanor and good for parents and good for everyone in the district. And spoiler alert on that talk, it is likely not for the reasons you think, but I think an interesting topic that we could explore at some point. But nevertheless, it means that there are benefits going to a few and being paid by many, okay? And that's important, I think, for citizens to understand as the school board approaches decisions, and hopefully will make you understand the things that are on our minds as we make some very difficult decisions. So that consider that controversial statement number 1, okay? Consider that controversial statement number 1. $22,000 per kid. A lot of people are paying it, and few people are feeling the direct benefit of it. Okay? Not a usual way you would look at public education, but it's our reality. Okay. The next section I'd like to talk about is borrowed shamelessly from our own Superintendent Danino's presentation that she gave a few weeks ago on the school budget, and talks about school rankings, okay? And I'm going to show you some pictures here, some charts. And I understand that charts are sometimes not as easy to read, interpret, digest as pictures of Eleanor and little kindergartners. But I'll do my best to walk you through it carefully and tell you why I think it really matters and that we should pay attention. Okay, so the Pittsburgh Pittsburgh Business Times every year ranks about 100 school districts in the region, okay? And they rank them based on performance on the Keystone exams, the standardized tests that children in various grades in public schools in the region, or in the Commonwealth rather, take every year, okay? And so I'm going to just show you a chart here. So this is a chart, kind of, there's a lot going on here, so I'll walk you through it. But across the top, on the x-axis, across the top, you'll see various grades, grades 3 through 11, which are the grades that actually are subjected to these tests that I mentioned, which are given out each year in the Commonwealth, okay? And then on the y-axis, on the vertical side, you'll see rankings, and this is a little weird. I think this will clear itself up when I show you an example. I'm going to show you an example here of the Mount Lebanon School District, and lest you jeer me for using Mount Lebanon as an example, I've heard it all. Okay, I get it. I've heard from you that you don't think that this is a legitimate comparison, perhaps to Riverview School District. That's fine. That's fine. I get it. The socioeconomics of that place are somewhat different. The size of the school is certainly much larger than ours. But nevertheless, I use it because I think it's an instructive example of what many people might think it looks like when public education is done the right way. Okay? And so what do I mean by that? So here's a picture of Mount Lebanon, and essentially what it shows you is that in grade 3, in the early grades, they get some smart young minds who do quite well on standardized tests and get top 10 ranking. Okay? And they put them through a treatment, and indeed by the end of that process in grade 11, those same students are still doing just as well, right? They're treating them with some educational process, and it's paying off because they're still ranked in the top 10 in the region, okay? And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Let me show you another example of an adjacent school. So this orange line here is the Plum School District adjacent to ours. I think probably generally thought of a decent school district, much bigger school than ours. And what you see here is that Plum starts off maybe with not the same benefits, maybe not the same excellence or raw materials that a place like Mount Lebanon might enjoy, but then stays relatively steady, and then over time you see that their ranking, as they get later and later, start to degrade. Okay? For any business people listening right now, you might call that degradation something like value destruction, right? Business term, value destruction. Essentially, you're taking a valuable raw material, you're putting it through some process, and the outcome, the thing that's produced on the other end, is actually not as good as what you had when you started. Okay? So that is the type of chart that would keep school administrators and school board members and teachers awake at night. It's not what we want to see. It's not what anyone wants to see. Okay? Let me use a third example. A third example is, I think, a pretty good similar district to compare us with. The green line down here is the Allegheny Valley School District, okay, which is a district somewhat similar to us, certainly similar to us in size, and somewhat similar to us, I think, in socioeconomic circumstances. And what you see with the Allegheny Valley School District, at least in this snapshot, is that they start off with not the inherent advantages of the other two districts I showed you. In other words, early on, their rankings are much, much lower, in fact, below average in the region. But over time, they put their students through some treatment, and if you look at grades 8 and grade 11, you'll see that they've gotten either to average or slightly above average by way of that treatment. And so that actually is the kind of chart that those same people would like to see. You'd like to see that the treatment you put these students through, the educational process, mattered, right, and resulted in real performance improvement. Okay? So those are three examples, just to give three very different examples that kind of give you a sense of what this means and how I interpret it, at least. So let's chart out where Riverview falls in all this, okay? And this gold line, which I show you here, is Riverview, okay? And I think this is maybe the most interesting line of all the lines that I just showed you, because it tells a very peculiar story. Okay, what it says to me is that in the early grades, in grade 3, 4, 5, and by the way, I don't get hung up, and I don't think we should get hung up on, are we ranked 3rd or are you ranked 10th? There is some amount of noise in this process that is just inherent in it. We're dealing with human beings, and so it's somewhat noisy. Where I get concerned, though, and where I think we all ought to be concerned, is when I start seeing 20, 30, 40, 50% degradation in rankings over time. Okay, that does not strike me as noise. It strikes me as something more profound is happening. And so I'm going to remove the others here and let you just kind of steep in that picture of what we're seeing. And I've heard a lot of arguments for, and by the way, this graph right here is one of the major reasons that I decided to run for school board, right? This is something that is of utmost concern, I think ought to be of utmost concern to all of us, and that if we don't attack it and get real about it, shame on us. Shame on us. So I think it's, and I think you'll see that the budget was constructed to help deal with this problem and help to take it on this year. But the arguments that I hear for why we are the way we are many. I hear several. One is that we simply don't have enough money. John, we're not Mount Lebanon. We don't have enough money to spend at that. To which I say, baloney. We spend $22,000 per child. In fact, that $22,000 per child puts us in the top 7 spending per student in the county. Okay, so we are at the very high end. And if I showed you, I don't have a chart of this, but if I showed you the other schools in that top 7, it's a very surprising picture. It's a combination of the schools that you might consider the very best and schools that you might consider some of the lower performers. So, you can spend a lot of money and do really great things with it, or you can spend a lot of money and and not have the outcomes you'd like. But we, I think, most would say we are neither at the top nor at the bottom, yet we are certainly in the top when it comes to the amount we spend. So I don't think money is a compelling argument. It's not one that moves me. The second thing I hear is that, John, our district is so small. You get a couple of poor performers on a test or a kid who's not good at test taking, and it can drag the whole average down. You're looking at averages here, John. Fine, to which I say, yes, but the district is small, which means a couple of really good performers or someone who has a really good day on a standardized test actually should drag the average up, right? So I don't think there's anything inherent about being small that would say that we would naturally expect poor performance over time. It just doesn't make sense to me, at least. The third thing I hear is, John, this is a story of adolescence. Don't you remember what it was like to be 15 years old? The hormones are racing, things are going crazy, you're on the cusp of adulthood, there's uncertainty in your life, you don't know what you're doing after school, and there are a lot of distractions. And I get that, and I think that's true, except that don't all these school districts deal with the same exact phenomenon? I don't think adolescence is unique to us. And so that one also is not to me a good explanation of what's happening here. And finally, I hear this explanation that perhaps the top performers in our district start off with us, but then leave us over time. Okay, we looked at that. It's a good, reasonable explanation. It turns out it's simply not true. It turns out that there are very few children who start with us and then leave our district over time. It's certainly not enough to explain the phenomenon that we see here. It is true, though, that in Oakmont and Verona, there are quite a few students who go to private schools, but most of them have been in private schools for their entire scholastic careers. They were never in the base data. They were never in the third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade numbers, okay? They just were not in our population. And actually, those are households that are paying taxes into our district to pay for that young man's $22,000 freight, which are not consuming resources from it and are not in our numbers. And so I think that argument also falls flat with me, because when we looked at it, we just didn't see a large number of students fleeing the school district, migrating out over time. So I think the problem is more subtle. I think, more importantly, I think our administrators and our teachers and our faculty think the problem is more subtle and needs to be dealt with. And I think this budget is constructed to try to do that. Okay. So consider that controversial statement number 2, and now I'd like to move on to talking about, in a little bit more detail, what's in this year's budget. So, a few weeks ago, if you came to a school board meeting about 6 weeks ago, you may have heard me give a talk on the state of the school budget, and at the time, we had a significant deficit we were trying to cover. We did not have enough forecasted taxes to cover our forecasted expenses. So there have been all sorts of clever, I think, suggestions and machinations and hard work that went into the last 6 weeks since then to actually come up with a budget which now, I'm proud to say, does balance, which is practically a very good thing, and it's also a legal imperative. So we do have a budget at this point that balances. And specifically, it balances at $22.3 million in revenues and $22.3 million in operating expenses. I have checked with the top mathematicians here at Carnegie Mellon, and indeed they confirmed that 22.3 does equal 22.3, so that's a good thing. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take each of these pieces in turn, first revenues and then the operating expenditures. So let's take a look at revenues. Okay, and I like this picture of a beaker. Let's fill up the beaker and try to figure out where do our revenues come from. Okay, so a large portion of the beaker is filled by $12.9 million in local property taxes. All right, these are the taxes that you pay as part of your mortgage payment in a lot of cases, but indeed you pay every year directly to the school district to pay for the educational process. And that is the largest single piece of our budget. Now, in this budget, there is a 2.5% property tax increase, which is probably not popular with many of you. I share that sentiment. It is not popular with me, but it's in there currently to balance the budget, and I think it is the most prudent thing that we can do in the short term while we figure out some more fundamental structural issues, because I think it makes sense not to create disruption in the short term while we figure out really what to do in the longer term. And so the budget that we are recommending at this point does have a 2.5% property tax increase embedded in it. The next large piece of revenue, and the one that gets probably the most press and a lot of discussion at school boards, is the amount of money that comes in from the state. Okay, and in our case, it's $6.3 million. It's a significant chunk. Really, if you look at the beaker, these two chunks are where the action is. Okay, there are some other pieces I'll show you in a second, but this is where the action is. This $6.3 million is also perhaps the most uncertain portion of the revenue side of our budget, right? And it is the one where if we were to suddenly get some significant cut to it, we would simply not be resilient to it. We would not be able to sustain it. And so this is one that's dangerous, and it's one that we think about, and it's one that we lobby about, and it's one that we talk to our reps about and encourage you to do the same. But that is the reality that we are facing. There are a couple other skinny pieces here that make up the rest of the revenue story. A big piece is delinquent property taxes, either property taxes levied in another year that were not collected for one reason or another. We have made a somewhat aggressive effort to go after those and to try to collect on those delinquencies. As well as when in your paycheck, you may notice a small, I think it's 1% local income tax. A portion of that does flow to the school district. And so there's another part there. And then finally, a very small chunk from the federal government and from other sources, generally for very targeted programs that the feds are funding. But that is the revenue story there, okay? And so, at Riverview, I should say. And I think hopefully shows you, when we talk about property tax increases, what we're talking about. You can see that when we raise taxes, it doesn't actually raise the entire revenue side, it's only a portion, and that lever is the one that we have to pull when you're constrained by either flat to down federal and state sources. All right. So let's shift gears to the operating side and do something similar. And the picture is remarkably, I think, similar to the one that I just showed you. Okay, so I just realized that I made these red and blue. This is not that was not political commentary to make them red and blue. In fact, if it were, I would probably have switched those colors. But on the revenue side, the major component of that budget is salaries, and that's salaries of teachers and support staff and administrators and so forth. And that's the single biggest chunk in a school budget. The next is about $3 million that go to benefits. And if there is a weapon of mass destruction in our budget, this is where it is. And you may look at that and say, how can that be, John? That's $3 million compared to the almost $10 million in salaries. And the reason is because this benefits number is the one that goes up at an alarming rate each and every year. And there's some sense from those of us who look at these things somewhat closely that not only does it go up at a somewhat unpredictable and high amount each and every year, but also, even though it does that, it's still not covering all the liabilities that are out there and that will eventually come due. And so that, again, is another topic for another day to get into kind of what's the nature of the structural problem we face. But that's something to keep in mind. And you can see just these two pieces do make up the bulk of the school budget. Some other things that are in there is $1.9 million for outplacement tuition and transportation, and these are generally for children who have very acute special needs that the district simply is not geared to handle, so we need to send them to other places outside the district to give those kids the care and education that they require. We have about $1.5 million of fixed debt service payments per year, and so this is debt that we have taken on in the past. to pay for our infrastructure, to pay for our buildings, to pay for our playgrounds, our roofs, our heating and air conditioning units, and so forth. But it's expensive to run the large buildings that we have, and that's what the debt service relates to. And then finally, there's this chunk at the top of $2.9 million of all other stuff that the school district will spend this year. And that includes things like books. It also includes things like energy bills. It includes insurance. It includes legal costs. It includes field trips. It includes all sorts of things that that a school needs to have to continue to run. And it is the case that the first four groups of costs that I showed you are generally in the short and medium term fixed costs. And what do I mean by fixed costs? That's really just a fancy accounting term to say that in the short run, I don't have a lot of ability to move them. Okay, there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do within a year to move those buckets, to move those amounts. The variable piece of our budget tends to be in that last chunk up top, that $2.9 million. Now, even though it's variable, in other words, we could flex it, much of it fast if we needed to. I mean, I suppose you could have fewer books, or you could share books, or you could use old books. There are generally things, though, that are not things that you would want to change. They are technically variable, but not things that are easy to change, and not things that wouldn't cause disruption if you did. So roughly the way to think about this is most of the budget is very, very rigid and not able to be moved in the short term, and a small piece of it can. And when we talk about spending cuts, we are generally talking about that last bucket at the top, that variable piece, right? But not really the bulk of the budget. And so that's really the operating expenditure story. So let me just talk about what a couple of things that are in the budget this year, okay? And I think this is probably the thing that most people are interested in. So I'll just give a couple of highlights. The first is that, remember the chart, right? There is in this budget included some intensive intervention for math and reading, okay? Some intensive intervention for the problems that we think those standardized tests are revealing for our kids, okay? And I think it would be negligent, frankly, if we didn't try to put all assets in the theater and really try to attack this problem the best way we know how. So there are two specialists that we intend to add, or at least are budgeted in this upcoming budget, which deal with that problem, in addition to some other investments, some training investments, some software investments for the teachers and administration on how do you create coherence across grades, how do you create coherence across buildings, because this is a multi-pronged approach. It's not just about adding a couple of more bodies to deal with it. It's about that plus doing some other process things that are going to be important. The next thing is, and I think there's probably a collective sigh of relief from the communities of Verona and Oakmont on this one. The next part of this budget is that it leaves both our specials and our class sizes alone for this year. Now, that is not a free lunch, okay? But I think, in my view, it's the most prudent thing to do in the short term as we figure out some more fundamental issues, which I will talk about in a minute. But as it stands in this budget, there is, and for the uninitiated, there's been a lot of discussion in the community lately about gym class in particular, and whether or not it makes sense to reduce the amount of gym class that our kids have at the elementary level. And as a father of three boys, I relate to that. I would love them to have 2 hours of gym class every single day, if that were a possibility. But that is not a free lunch, the fact that we left that one alone. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, the last highlight I'll show you here is that there are significant savings baked into this budget for the energy savings projects that I talked about 6 weeks ago in a presentation I gave on the budget. We're essentially doing some capital improvements with the idea that they will save money on our utility bills, and that savings we are baking into basically it's a trade-off. We're doing these program things and trading them off for some savings on the utility side. And that is baked into the budget. Okay. So let me tell you about bullet number 2 in particular and why I'm struggling and where I think our vulnerabilities lie. And I'm going to do that conceptually because this is a problem that deserves to be studied very carefully. We have not done that yet. I have not done that yet. But I've been staring at this budget process for the last 6 months or so, and there are some things I think in the background which are looming, which are very troubling. And so I want to tell you about what that means conceptually. What I really mean is do not hold me precisely to the numbers I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you some charts. Don't hold me to it. I'm trying to illustrate a concept. All right, and the concept here at Riverview is as follows. Okay, these are 2 lines of our forecasted expenses over time and our forecasted revenue over time, okay? And if we did no tax increases, you see the tax line is flat and the expense line is accelerating. The expense line is rising at a much steeper pace. And it creates a wider and wider gap between our expenses and our revenues each and every year, okay? That's the fundamental problem that we face. An acceleration of costs and a lot of difficulty accelerating revenues to match, okay? And by the way, you might say, and a lot of people in the community have said, why wouldn't we just raise taxes? You haven't raised taxes in the last 2 years. Why don't we just raise taxes every year to pay for the things we need? And that is not, in my view, a slam dunk, okay? Remember Eleanor. There are a lot more Eleanors than there are people that benefit directly from continuous tax increases. But when I show you the story here in a minute, the real story is even worse than this. Because the real story here is, even if we were to raise property taxes each and every year, I can't raise them fast enough or high enough to cover the increases, the obligated increases in our expenses, okay? Remember that budget, remember that red beaker, right? Most of our expenses are fixed and have escalators. They are contractual and have escalators in those contracts, which make the expenses go up every year, okay? The revenue side, remember when we raise revenues, I'm only talking about a piece of the blue beaker, right? And I cannot raise that fast enough for a lot of reasons. First of all, the tax base won't tolerate it. But secondly, because there are some laws in the state of Pennsylvania which don't even allow us to raise it as fast as we would need to close that gap, okay? So this is the fundamental structural story. And this is what's looming in the background every time I hear, and I don't mean disrespect by this, but every time I hear from community members about some narrow issue du jour that they think is really important for us to address. And I generally agree with them. I want the things that we have. I value the things that make us distinctive. I think the other board members do too. But this is looming in the back of many of our minds, okay? That it feels sometimes like fiddling while Rome burns when we talk about some narrow issue, some narrow program, the team that needs new uniforms, an investment in this software or that, why the kids need new laptops, and so on and so on and so forth, okay? This is looming in the background. This is really the problem that we need to deal with, okay? And that's cold comfort to many of you. I get it, I know. Some of you will say, wow, I didn't know this. Some of you may say, I don't trust what he's saying. Some of you may say, I don't care, I still want what I want. But nevertheless, I think it's the facts before us, and we need to study it. Now, the other question I get a lot of, and it's a really good question from the community, is what about all that new development down on the river? What about the river's edge and Edgewater developments down on the river? There's a lot of beautiful, expensive homes down there, new homeowners moving to town, and should be some property tax revenue generated. Where does that put us? And so I think that's a great question, and I looked at this, again, high level, needs to be studied a little closer, but essentially this is what it does to the revenue and expense picture when we add all that new property down by the river. Essentially what it does is it does help us in the short term, okay? It masks some of the structural underlying problems that we have. It covers us for some period of time, okay? We get a bump in revenue. Revenues go up for some short period of time faster than expenses, okay? Which creates some surplus. But underneath it, it doesn't change the fundamental problem that your expenses are still rising faster than your property taxes ever could, okay? So that's the story of Edgewater and the River's Edge. It's good. I'm thrilled that we have it. It's important. It helps. It doesn't solve the underlying problem, though. Okay? It doesn't solve the underlying problem. So, so that's the story. So, okay, John, great. So thanks for painting such a bleak picture. What the hell do we do about all this, right? You may be asking. Here's one way to go, and here's the way I'd like to see us go this year. Okay, what I would recommend, if I were king for a day and could wave my scepter, I would recommend that we pass this year's budget as is, i.e., let's not create a lot of disruption in the short term. But we really need to study the problem that I just illustrated on the three previous slides, right? We need to really understand our long-term financial health. And I think that we could pass it this year, and basically most people would get what they want out of this budget. But I think it's time that we really start to face reality, okay? And the way that we do that, you may have heard that a few weeks ago in one of our voting meetings, we voted I raised a motion and it passed to do a study of our long-term financial health. It's because of, and I was a little unfair, I think, to other board members perhaps, because I hadn't described to them everything I'm describing today. But this is always looming in the background of the way I'm thinking about these problems, and I think we don't understand them well enough yet and need to understand them before we start making dramatic moves and changing programs and shifting teachers and so forth. But I think it's time to get real. And when I hear somewhat clever, if imperfect, solutions by our administrators, by our principals, by our superintendent, by teachers to perhaps shift a teacher from subject A to subject B, that is clever and imperfect, as I mentioned. It's the reality of what we face when we have a small district where we are budget constrained and yet value class sizes and so forth. I think it's more of that is quite likely on the horizon. I think we ought to sit shoulder to shoulder and figure out how best to address it. But I think that this process is not going to be painless. I think we're going to incur collectively some pain as we figure this out. So this is ultimately about, I think, finding a sustainable path. And the motion I raised a few weeks ago, which passed to do the study that I mentioned, is seeking to do just that, okay? Because I think ultimately there is consensus both in the community and I think on the board also to try to avoid a merger with another district, right? That's something that happens that you might hear about in other districts, and I think it would be most of our preferences that we would avoid such a thing. But we will not avoid such a thing by pretending it's not a possibility, by pretending it's not out there on the horizon, given the problems I just described, right? Given the fact that we spend a lot already, given the fact that it is not translating all these things that make us distinctive, the class sizes, the community schools, the specials, are not translating into actual performance in the classroom. We like them, we think they're important, but they're not, but remember the chart. They're not translating into the things that we'd like them to translate into. And so this is about finding a sustainable path, and shame on us next year if we're in the same situation and we don't understand this a whole lot better. So the process that I would like to undertake this year is to look at the tax capacity. How much pain could our current tax base even endure at this point? I have my sense of what that would be. I think it's very little, but maybe I'll learn otherwise. Maybe we'll study it and we'll say, you know what, there's actually a heck of a lot more capacity in the tax base and willingness to pay for all the things that make this district special. I'm open to that. We need to do something similar, projecting the long-term cost of the district and the long-term building cost of the district. That would be part of this look that we take. I think public policy solutions are in order. I think we certainly would not have the ability as a school board or as a district or as a couple of towns to annex more tax base, to annex more students. into our district, that would be a public policy maneuver, but it's one I think we could catalyze, and it's one that we could lobby for, and it's one that we need, I think, to creatively explore. Could be part of the answer here. And then infrastructure consolidation, and I mean that both in terms of our building infrastructure and our program infrastructure, right? And we want to look at this carefully and see what the trade-offs are and make sure we're not amputating something that's so fundamental to us that the district just looks completely different. But the reality is that the things that make us distinctive, our community schools, our small class sizes, our extracurriculars, our specials, art, music, and gym, and so forth, are expensive. They're an expensive proposition. And this process of educating kids is a tricky, intricate process, and the system is very interdependent. And so you don't want to do this lightly. And so I would like to take the next 9 to 12 months to study these things and make the best possible decisions and not willy-nilly inflict small pain on the community and on the children of the district without studying all these things very carefully. So I will end on that somewhat down note, but thank you for listening. I do encourage you to come to our meetings. I encourage you to talk to us in the community when you see us about the things that are on your mind. But I encourage you also to think about some of the things I said, and I hope it helped change some of your thinking, and perhaps even some of the thinking of some other school board members, I don't know, I hope so, about the long-term situation that we're faced with. Thank you.